The Bible. I assume you're thinking of reading it since you clicked on this video. Maybe you've already started reading it. You just want to know more about it. Where did it come from? Who wrote it? Who put it all together? What's it all about? Those are the questions I'm going to be answering for you in this short video. So the Bible is actually a library. Each of these tabs is a separate book. There's 66 of them. There's books on history, poetry, letters from one people to a church, one person to another. There's letters of prophecy. There's 4 eyewitness accounts of Jesus' ministry. And there's one apocalyptic book called the Book of Revelation. So who wrote it? Where did it come from? When did they write it? The Bible has 40 different authors, and it was written in native languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And it was written over a period of 1,600 years, authored in 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. So what does it tell you? Well, the Bible tells you about God's creation and his relationship with the greatest of his creation, you and me. It tells you about man's rebellion against God and his separation from God. It tells you about man's redemption and his restoration with God. So, the structure of the Bible is in 2 main components. The first 2/3 of the Bible is the Old Testament, which has 39 books, also known as the Jewish Bible. It's also known as the Tanakh. The New Testament, you can think of as kind of an extension, at least from the Christian perspective. It's a kind of an extension of the Jewish Bible, and it has 27 books. Now the big question, what makes it the Word of God? Well, I can't prove to you that it's the Word of God. I don't think anybody can prove it. But once you become familiar with it and you start reading the breadth of this book, you're going to understand, or start to understand, that this extraordinary collection of books present an astonishing unity, thematically, historically, prophetically, and theologically. It's really quite amazing. So let's talk about the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's also called the Torah, and it's the oldest written words in the Bible. And it's basically the foundation of God's law and his teachings, and it's foundational to the Jewish faith. It was written by Moses around the 13th to 12th century BC. That's a long time ago. That's like a really long time ago. Now, back in those days, they didn't have books. They weren't publishing. They were writing on scrolls. Okay, so Moses wrote down these words in scrolls, and then as the Jewish faith progressed, new rabbis would come up. They would copy those words onto new scrolls to take back to their temple, and they would teach their flock about the Jewish law and the teachings of God from these scrolls. Now, these 5 scrolls were eventually compiled together as the foundational teachings of God's law. And that happened around the 6th to 5th century BC. Next in the Old Testament, we have a number of historical books. And this includes Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And these books talk about the history of the Israeli people, the Hebrews at the time. It takes you from the conquest of Canaan, when they first met the Promised Land, to the various monarchies and kings and Babylonian exile, up to about the 5th or 4th century BC. Next is a selection of books called the wisdom literature, and these were written from the 10th century BC to about the 3rd century BC, so a very wide span of time. And these are a collection of songs and prayers in the book of Psalms and the Song of Solomon. It has snippets of wisdom written down in a book called Proverbs. And then the book of Job and Ecclesiastes basically expound on the human condition. Then we have the prophetic books. And the Old Testament prophets were people that talked on behalf of God. And they provided and wrote down messages of guidance, of warning, and of judgment to the Hebrew people as well as other civilizations at times too. And most of the prophets were writing around the 8th century BC to the 6th century BC. Now, in the Old Testament, there are basically 2 sections of prophets. We have the major prophets, and these are the longer prophetic books. This includes Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then we have the minor prophets, which are shorter prophetic books. And that includes Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So all of these books make up the Old Testament. And what happened was, as the Jewish church, if you will, was expanding, the Jewish people were building temples and expounding and advancing the Jewish faith. These scrolls were slowly collected over time, and they eventually made it into a collection of books that became the foundation of the Jewish faith, and that's what gave us the Old Testament and the Jewish Bible. There's really no difference between the two, with the exception that you're going to see I think 3 or 4 less books in the Hebrew Bible than the Christian Bible, but that's only because the Jewish faith combined 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings into 3 separate books instead of 6 books. So there's no 1st or 2nd. It's just the name of the, it's Kings or Chronicles or what have you. So. Whereas the Christian Bible, in their Old Testament, they broke those out into basically 2 books to cover that text. So that is the Jewish Bible, and the Jewish Bible is very important to Christianity because it's the foundation for the expansion into the ministry of Christ, which Christians look at as a continuation of the Jewish foundation. Of course, as you probably know, Jesus was Jewish, and it just kind of picks up the story and carries it on through Jesus' ministry and then the early advance of the Christian church. So let's now talk about the New Testament. For the first 200 years, Christianity depended on various writings that were favored to teach the faith through their churches. And what they favored was writings of the apostles or very close associates of the apostles. For instance, Mark, who wrote the book of Mark or the Gospel of Mark, was Peter's interpreter and was very, very close to Peter. And, I'm sure heard him talk about his eyewitness, about Peter's eyewitness of Jesus, dozens and probably really hundreds of times. And the same goes for Luke. Luke also wrote a gospel, and he was the assistant of Paul. Now, Paul was kind of the number one guy. He gave us about half of the New Testament books. So Luke was very, very keyed in. Even though he wasn't an eyewitness to Christ's ministry, he was very, very close to it, and everyone knew that. So the Christian church early on really favored first century writings by the apostles and the apostles' close associates. And through years 100 to 200 AD, these writings of the soon-to-be New Testament books were widely distributed in the church, and eventually were collected and became the New Testament, which we have today. It's interesting to note, a lot of people argue that through translations and writing, the game of telephone, he tells her, she tells him, so on and so forth, the message gets corroded over time. Well, we have, some people say 5,200, other people say 5,800 ancient manuscripts from within a few decades of these original scrolls that were written on the New Testament. So we're able to compare many, 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 many passages of what was written within a few decades of these writings to what we have today. And there's virtually no difference. There's no substantial difference. So we're very, very confident when we read the New Testament that we're reading very accurately transcribed writings that properly reflect writings from way back in the first and second century. So that's an important point. Now, let's run through the books very quickly as we did with the Old Testament. So the Gospels, these are eyewitness accounts of Jesus' ministry. And they were written between 50 and 90 AD. And it's very important to note that each of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have a slightly different, they were written for a different audience. They have a slightly different take on the ministry of Jesus. So for instance, Matthew was Jewish. He was a Jewish tax collector. And when he wrote his gospel, he was writing primarily for the Jewish people. So he wrote a lot about Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. He quotes more Old Testament passages than any other gospel because that would have been important to the Jewish reader. Then you have Mark. Now, Mark was the very first gospel written, so it's the earliest one we have, and it was written by a close associate of Peter. And he primarily focused on Jesus' actions. So it's a very active, Jesus did this, Jesus did that kind of thing. So there's a lot of action going on in the book of Mark. And then we have Luke. Luke is a very detailed account of Jesus, beautifully written. And he was, again, a close associate of Paul. Luke was a physician. And as such, he focused a lot on the miraculous healings of Jesus more than any other gospel. And then we have John. Now, John was the last gospel to be written. So he was very aware of Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, and undoubtedly knew them very, very well. And he wanted to write a supplement to those three gospels that focused on evangelism and theology. So we like to call John's gospel the spiritual gospel, and it's a very, very appropriate name for it. It is an incredible book. It's very powerful, and it begins, with the famous words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now, what John's doing there is he's hearkening back to the very first line of the Old Testament, which is, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And God did that through speaking, through his word. So you can see how it ties together, and this is a great example of how the Old Testament is constantly referring back to how the New Testament is constantly referring back to the Old Testament, and they just come together beautifully. So it's a great example of that. After the four Gospels, which are the first four books of the New Testament, we get into Acts. Now, Acts was written by Luke around the same time as Luke, and Acts is a history of the early church, and he wrote that between 80 and 90 AD. Then we have the Pauline Epistles. The epistles are just letters. So these are letters by Paul, and they're primarily to churches, although there are a few letters that were written to individuals. And they go all over the place. Sometimes it's chastising a church where they're doing something wrong. It's trying to prevent a problem with the church. So you have a lot of church structure in some of these letters. Other times it's some of the most profound theological writings that you'll ever come across. So those are the Pauline Epistles. Then we have the General Epistles, which there aren't quite as many, but that's Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. And these are letters written by other apostles that were written between 60 and 100 AD. Lastly, we have the apocalyptic book, the book of Revelation. And this was written by John, who was given a revelation by God, literally a vision, while he was imprisoned in a cave on the island of Patmos. And not something I would suggest you read out of the gate, first book of the Bible. Don't go to Revelation. It takes a long time to get it, and it takes a lot of resources, extra biblical resources to figure it out. Apocalyptic literature is very, very different literature than, say, the Gospels. But it is a fascinating book, and it's, of course, about the end times of the earth. So that is what the Bible is. That's how it came to be. That's who wrote it. That's how it was put together. The next step to determining for yourself what the Bible is and how it applies to your life is to simply begin reading it, which can seem still like a daunting task, but hopefully this video helped you out a little bit. The next video in this series will give you a simple and effective strategy, and it'll give you a number of them and different options on how to explore these ancient texts of the Bible. So be sure to check that out to continue your journey with my favorite book, the Bible. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Please like the video if you got something out of this video, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one.